Tonight I'm going to read a portion of a book I've wrote a few years ago called 9/11 Act 2. Chapter 1. In the beginning was the plan. Musaf detested mixing with the American infidels, but he knew what Allah had demanded. He must do Allah's bidding. It was hard to admit, but 9/11 was a failure. Few of the faithful understood that. Most thought it was a great victory. Too few of the infidels died. The infidel nation was not thrown into chaos. Strangely, none of the infidels seemed to know that either. Only 3 of the 4 planes that were taken hit their targets. One failure in 4 was bad enough, but the results were even worse. Through some evil act of Satan, in New York the 2 towers were hit, but over 30,000 of the infidels got out of the building before the collapse, and thus so many escaped the judgment of Allah. His name be praised. An infidel who planned the evacuation, however, was dead, killed when he went back just before the collapse. Allah be praised for his death. In D.C., the pilot, the fool, was out drinking the night before. He was probably hung over. He dropped too low and hit the ground before hitting the building, slowing the plane and reducing the impact, and more important, the penetration into the softer areas. May he face the wrath of Allah. Less than 200 of the infidel died there, the very infidel that had led the forces of Satan that have oppressed the people of Allah. At least 30,000, possibly 45,000 of Satan's disciples should have died on 9/11, but the number was less than 3,500. But the real act of Satan was on Flight 93. The instrument of Satan, Todd Beamer, his seed be damned forever, prevented that flight from reaching its target. It killed 53 people, including the 5 faithful who sacrificed their lives. Allah be praised. It should have killed over 2,000 of the infidels who led this evil empire of Satan. Flight 93 was to hit the Capitol. Worse, 2 other attacks were thwarted by the infidel. 5 of the faithful were at Logan to board a flight to Colorado. That flight was delayed for 2 hours due to a mechanical problem. After the towers were hit, it was canceled. It should have hit the other side of the Pentagon. Another flight from New York, destined for the West Coast, was also delayed for over an hour because of a crew member was sick, and they called for a replacement. Had that flight taken off, it would have been the second plane into the Capitol. With all of that, 9/11 was a failure. It did not bring the desired results, and worst, it unleashed a firestorm in Muslim countries, one loyal to Allah, one's carrying the true faith, both from within and without. It also cast suspicion on Muslims everywhere, making it more difficult to carry out the will of Allah, to make the world Muslim. Even some of the faithful questioned the action, and some left the faith. For 12 years now, Musaf had lived with the infidel, preparing, working, and planning. He had planned and saw carried out several small missions. These were practice. His mission was not to make a nuisance strike, but to strike a mortal blow to the infidel. Although a failure, 9/11 had been a terrible blow and shed some light on how an attack might be made more devastating. If the faithful learned from it, that could make it a success. After the attack, the infidel shut down the whole air traffic system to contain it. That disruption to the infidel was a significant part of the damage. In fact, probably more devastating than the loss of the towers and the damage to the Pentagon. Musaf's plan was simple. The infidel empire did not run on oil, as many in both his country and the infidel thought. It ran on a fuel called commerce. That fuel was not burned, it was circulated. It was like blood in the human body. Take away that circulation and it was dead. Musaf's plan was to attack that circulation and stop it. If he could stop the flow, the infidel empire would collapse. It would no longer be able to produce the weapons to oppress the followers of Allah. Faced with beheading, the weak infidel would convert to Islam. Many before him had devised schemes to make it happen. All were exotic, required many resources, and failed when executed, even if they could be executed. Many were so complex they were detected before they were executed, some before the planning was complete. The infidels seemed to have spies everywhere. Musaf had looked at attacking railroads, trucks, and ships. All were too diverse targets to effectively hit. Take out one train, one ship, one station, one pier, a dozen trucks, or a big terminal, and the system was robust enough it would be no more impact than a small cut on a man's hand. To be effective, an attack had to be one stab wound to the heart, or many that would cause it to bleed out. Looking at the impact of 9/11, he saw something. The real impacts were the changes to the American society and the disruption of their economy. For a couple of days, planes were grounded. It had a terrible impact on their infrastructure. Goods were stuck at one place or another. Some of those were perishable and spoiled. Some were dated and lost their value. A few more days and some products would have disappeared from the store shelves. Manufacturers, particularly those small high-dollar value items, would have had to stop work because they lacked the materials to make the product and the space to store the finished products. Their materials arrived, JIT, just in time. There was little raw material to make the product and minimal product storage space. The airlines were hit for longer periods because people were afraid to fly. A few were saved only by mergers. Airlines operate on very small margins that could be upset by a 5% reduction in passengers. On a 250-passenger plane, it took about 180 passengers to break even. Less than that, the flight lost money. But the added cost of adding another passenger, once you had paid the fuel, pilots, flight attendants, ramp fees, and the other costs that were very near the same if the plane was full or empty, that additional cost was minimal. It may be less than 5% of the person's ticket price. That is why people could fly standby for very low rates. If the airline got 25% of the ticket for those added ones, they made money. Not much, but it was positive. Shut down this, and every part of the infidel empire's lifeblood stopped circulating. 9/11 caused a shutdown for a few days. It slowed it for several months, but enough kept circulating to keep the organism going, and it recovered. Over a couple of years, a plan surfaced in his mind. He had to do two things. First was create destruction, and the second, create hysteria. He was sure that significant destruction and death would lead to hysteria. Give it enough help, and it would feed on itself. George W. Bush, his name be damned forever, had instituted a plan called Shock and Awe before the Iraq invasion. It was aimed directly at the heart of Islam. Bush wanted to destroy Islam. It was backed by military might, but a major part of that plan was designed to create hysteria in the ranks of the Iraqi army. For 4 weeks, Bush kept talking about his plan, Shock and Awe. He talked like it was invincible. It sounded like he had some fantastic new weapon. The more he talked, the more fear was instilled in the hearts of the Iraqi army. Many had seen the devastation his father had heaped upon Iraq. They remembered the trail from Kuwait littered with bodies and vehicles. They remembered the awful American A-10 spreading death with that terrible gun that cut through armor like it was tissue paper. Then there were the British tornadoes spreading death across the area. Each aircraft spread thousands of bomblets over a large area. They killed and maimed soldiers and destroyed trucks. They remembered the whispering death, the M1A1 tank. They were quiet, fast, and could hit many targets very fast. You knew one was present when a couple of tanks near yours blew up in rapid succession. Now his son was promising even worse. Few could comprehend what could be worse, but they believed it would be. That fear was a significant part of the American drive into Iraq. That fear created defeat as much as the weapons. Musaf's plan would create the same fear in the infidel empire. The concept of his plan was communicated to a trusted few, and resources were pledged. Musaf would start working on the plan and execution. Thousands of the infidel would die, and fear would spread like wildfire. The infidel would experience shock and awe. 9/11 proved something crucial. By taking out 4 planes, the system was shut down for a short time. His plan was simple: take down 25 or 30 planes in diverse locations. 9/11 took a team of 5 per plane, including the ones that failed, about 30 people. It took many resources to train these men to fly the planes. Training 40 or even 20 5-man teams would be impossible. There must be a better plan. With the proper weapons, 2 relatively untrained men could be effective for Act 2. Even 1 man might be able to be effective. Unlike the planes of 9/11, which required tens of hours of flight training, the weapon he proposed could be used with only a short briefing. They would not need pre-attack training that could compromise the mission. That meant he would need about 90 men, 90 vehicles, and at least 90 sets of weapons. He could find the men and the vehicles. He laughed as he thought about it. Like on 9/11, the infidel would provide the weapons of his own demise. Musaf searched the web. He must find a way to get access to about 100 Stinger missiles or some equivalent. Musaf set up a meeting with 4 other high-level operatives at a rest stop along the Jersey Turnpike. To do that, a message was posted on a Facebook page, but it looked like 4 guys with British names were meeting to discuss Shakespeare at a restaurant. They arrived at the rest stop. There was 1 other car there. The 4 men waited until the couple left and then sat at the picnic table and talked. 2 hours later, they were leaving with orders. The plan was never exposed to the risk of passing it over the internet or telephone. 3 of the men returned to the Middle East. They would not stay in the U.S. and risk being caught and interrogated. Only Musaf would stay, and if he were captured, the operation would be canceled. 1 of the men would recruit young men who would go to the U.S. to study. Each was offered 2 years of education at a major university if they would pledge allegiance to Allah and agree to act against the infidel. None were given any terrorist training except a 2-hour briefing, which did not include anything about the mission. It was information on how to communicate and strict instructions on how to avoid scrutiny. They were trained individually and did not meet any of the others. Over the next 5 months, the work continued, and soon about 100 operatives were in place. They continued to work to get a few more in place in case some were exposed. The men were only told that they must remain loyal to Allah, but to stay away from any Muslim or Arab groups and individuals. It was essential that none of them looked like a threat. They were encouraged to mix with Americans. They should pray privately and not attend mosques. By now, more than 30 sleeper cells of 3 men had been inserted, 1 in each city to be attacked, but none of them knew there were others, including the ones that were in the same cell. Even the training was done so that the ones in the same city would not know any of the others. They were forbidden to take pictures and were only identified in the class by number. They would be advised of the other members of their cell just before the mission. All were students in universities. The operation called for 2 people to carry out the attack. The third at each city, usually in the same university, would do the pre-attack reconnaissance and be a reserve. Each of the students was given money to buy a van and told to keep it in running condition. All they knew was they may be called upon at any time to please Allah. The other man returned to the Middle East and made contact with others who would help him obtain the weapons they would need to carry out the plan. The 4th was the one who would obtain and distribute the funding. Musaf now had to prepare the details of the plan. He started pulling information for the airports in the cities where these men were located. He had picked cities with airports that were busy enough that the planes were taking off close together. He did not have a list of who the men were, only that they were there and in what town. Their names would be given later. He pulled up the Google Earth for each airport, looked at the runway orientations, prevailing wind directions, and put together a list of places that needed a ground inspection. The list was hand-carried to someone outside the country. This person's name was not known to even Musaf. He placed the list in a drop, and it was picked up. The men in the teams had nothing but a list of email addresses and a CD with encryption keys. They were called one-time keys. They would each be used for one message and then never used again. Over the next weekend, one member of each team would get a message that directed them to pull down a message from the server and decrypt it. The message telling them to do that was sent in the clear and only said that there was a package being sent them by their family. A few days later, each of them got a package from home. The FBI intercepted 6 of them, carefully checked them, resealed them, and passed them on. There was nothing in it that raised any concern. The message on the server, when decrypted, directed them to drive certain roads like they were sightseeing over weekends. They should carry picnic gear and do some hiking. The package from home was a ruse to help blind the enemy. End of chapter 1.